So it's April again, that time of year when every dutiful American spends a few hours downloading expensive software and cursing their government. Tax season. Firstly, you might be thinking, I'm not an American, so I don't care, but let me tell you why you do care. Because the money that people pay in taxes goes to fund the production of these, and we have more of these than you do, so listen up. It's also worth mentioning that the two major political parties in America, the Democrats and the Republicans, are heavily divided on basically everything I say in this video, and since I fall pretty solidly in the middle of these two, I'll do my best to maintain an unbiased tone. Before we get into where the money comes from, let's talk about where it goes. Now let's clear this up from the beginning. We're talking about federal taxes here, not state or local taxes. State and local taxes include things like sales tax on goods and services, whereas federal taxes mainly include income tax, but more on that revenue later. So let's simply run through where all of our tax dollars go, or at least where they went in 2015. At the top of the list, we have entitlement spending. As a nation, we spent about $1.25 trillion on this in 2015. This includes things like Social Security, welfare, and unemployment insurance. Many people argue that while this is a lot of money, it's necessary to care for the poor, while others say that it actually hurts the poor by increasing their dependence on the government. Regardless, everyone has to pay in a Social Security, which is automatically deducted from your paycheck. This federal entitlement program is fairly well respected by both Democrats and Republicans because you get back roughly what you put into it. We'll talk about this issue later when we discuss the debt. Secondly, we spend about $1 trillion on healthcare every year. This includes Medicare and Medicaid, which pays for the healthcare for the poor and the elderly. Surprisingly, Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act adds a negligible amount of spending to this category. Third, we have military spending, of course, totaling around $609 billion. The United States spends more on military than the next, well, all of them. Yes, that includes you, Kim, no matter what you like to think. Next, we spend about $229 billion every year on the interest of our national debt. We spend $160 billion to take care of our veterans, $136 billion on food and agriculture, $100 billion in education, $85 billion on transportation, $61 billion on government housing, $50 billion on international affairs, $45 billion on energy subsidies, and about $30 billion on science and technology. Altogether, this makes for about $3.8 trillion in spending every year. This can be split into two categories, mandatory and discretionary spending. The difference is that discretionary spending must be included in the congressional legislation every year, whereas mandatory spending goes into effect regardless of whether or not a law is passed. So the government needs $3.8 trillion. Where does it get it from? Well, you. About 50% of federal revenue comes from the average taxpayer. Now this of course includes Social Security, which some people argue shouldn't be counted as tax revenue, but officially it's included in your income tax. Secondly, it's you again. The government gets about a third of its revenue from payroll taxes, which are paid jointly by you and your employer. Next, about 10% of our government's income comes from corporate income taxes, which some people argue should be quite a bit higher. The remaining revenue comes from things like duties on foreign goods and spare change that the IRS finds on the sidewalk. However, when you add all of this up, we're $583 billion short, and over the year, we've racked up quite a lot of debt, specifically $19 trillion as of the start of 2016. So how do we cover this deficit? Loans. Lots of loans. So where do we get our loans? Well, the largest portion of our loans come from international investments. For example, when the United States is running low on funds, we go to China and say, yo, China, can you hit us up? And China says, yeah, fam, we got you, and that's how politics works. The second largest portion of our debt comes from federal accounts, which are a bit more difficult to understand. Debts held by federal accounts is the amount of money that the government has borrowed from itself. That may sound odd, but let me use an example. Say the military needs more money and the Treasury doesn't have enough to give them. So what do? They take money from places that already have money, like Social Security, and give it to the military. This would be fine, except military spending falls under discretionary spending, while Social Security is mandatory spending. This means that Social Security is supposed to act as a trust fund, remember how taxpayers pay directly into it? So now the government is in debt to Social Security, which is part of the government itself. Confusing, right? Third is pretty easy to understand. Congress just borrows money from individual people and, of course, banks, where they get a large return on their investment. Next, we have the Federal Reserve, which is a government entity as well, but isn't supposed to be considered as a government entity. The government can borrow money from them as they generate their own revenue through the process of buying and selling bonds. Finally, of course, we have debt to states and local governments. If Texas has a tax surplus, and through some miracle of God they always seem to, then the Treasury can borrow money from the Texan government. So we seem to have gotten a little off topic here, but it's all related. It's April, and you need to file a tax return. What are those? Well, it's a little complicated, but in effect, they're basically an interest-free loan that the government is taking from you, without asking you, of course. Allow me to explain. When you file a tax return, the government sees how much you paid and how much you should have paid. If the amount paid exceeds how much you owed, then congrats, you get your money back. That money you got back, by the way, belonged to the government for the last 12 months, thereby acting as a loan. See? And the genius of this system is that you, the taxpayer, feels like you're making extra money, which you then go out and are more likely to spend helping the economy and generating more tax revenue. If, however, you find that the government didn't take enough from you, then you give the government more taxes to fill in that difference. It's a very delicate system, and whether you think the government takes too much from you or too little from everyone else, it's difficult to argue that the government isn't an agency capable of immense good. It just depends on how you look at it. Did you enjoy this episode? Put a like down there and subscribe to see more. Have you got a question you'd like to see answered? Put your question in the comments and we'll be happy to create a video.